thank you, Roger, and great to see everybody. Great to be here today. Happy February and happy 20th anniversary of the 2002 Olympic Winter Games. Now, I put a pin on this morning. You can see this. This is an Olympic pin. This is the 9/11 commemorative pin. And I put it on because I didn't want to dive in to talk about Utah economy without just stopping for a minute and honoring this day. Tonight, they're going to light the cauldron up at Rice Eccles Stadium. Henry Thoreau said, "What lies behind us and what lies ahead of us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us." If you remember at the time of the Olympics, this was a quote that was shared as they talked about lighting the fire within. February 8th, our city looked like this. Most of you will remember that it snowed the night before the lead ceremony. And then it didn't snow again for the rest of the games, which was perfect for avalanche, for transportation, for everything. President Bush, George W. Bush, came in Air Force One 20 years ago today. And I worked at the Capitol at the time, and I can remember from the offices in the Capitol, you could see the tarmac, the runways at the Salt Lake City International Airport, and we could see Air Force One, just the image of it. And we were so excited because this was the first presidential visit to the Utah State Capitol. And in a fun way, President Bush brought, I think it was 9 cabinet members with him that day. So the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Interior, the Secretary of Energy. Just a really special day for our state. President Bush, like I mentioned, spoke at the state capitol and had the Mormon Tabernacle Choir sing the battle hymn of the Republic behind him. Just incredible. It brought tears to my eyes. Opening ceremony was obviously just a terrific event at Rice Eccles Stadium. I remember the very solemn moment when they brought out the 9/11 flag. You can see it there, torn and ripped. I was at the stadium at the time, and it felt completely silent as they marched in this flag. Many of you will remember the Children of Light, and then the U.S. hockey team that lit the cauldron, which again they're going to light tonight. So this cauldron still stands up there, and tonight at 6 o'clock, state dignitaries will light it. I want to just close by, I wanted to just feel this Olympic spirit mostly, but I want to just close by telling you a quick story about Sarah Hughes, who was the gold medalist in figure skating 20 years ago. She was 16 at the time. She was studying for the SAT. Some of you remember she went into the last night of the program, their steps to the figure skating gold, the long program, and she was in 3rd and did so well that she jumped to 1st place and got the Olympic gold for the United States. I was at the Salt Palace, which was the media center after her performance. It would be the next day, and I watched her address the international media in a room that was about twice the size, and there was a camera for every one of the heads in this room. That's what it's like during the Olympic Games. And she looked at them and said, not everybody gets the chance to skate the performance of their life. I did. Really amazing. So, just for fun, sorry this is a little bleached out here, but what I'll say is the learnings I took from the games make every moment last because it goes fast. Big dreams can come true. Think of Apollo Antonio, Sarah Hughes. There will be setbacks, some of them very large. And I'm thinking of 9/11 and what that did to our games. And the last one there says, never give up on your desire to skate the performance of your life. So let's just give a hand to our state for that incredible experience. So this is the message I came prepared to share, but I wanted to just pay respect to the moment and challenge all of you to do your little thing with your family, with your loved ones, to talk about what this meant to our state. And as you know, we are now the bid city for the United States of America. We're America's choice. They haven't decided when they're going to let us bid again, but it will either be 2030 or 2034. And My guess, 2030. So keep an eye. Well, I got a really difficult assignment today because the Bank of Utah said, come to Salt Lake City and share a message about Utah economy. And it's a really challenging, difficult time. And if I had to ask you to pick a word to describe 2021, 2022, I think a lot of people would say, well, divided, challenging, worried, frustrated, uncertainty, volatility. Got on this slide, hopeful. And what I want to do today is kind of weave a story together, and I'm going to invite you into a kitchen. And basically, we're going to make a stew. All right, we're going to make a warm winter stew. But as I do that, I want to set it up by reading to you two quotes. One of them very long, but one of them is from the Week magazine, the editor-in-chief, a guy named William Fall. And on December 31st, 2021, so at the end of last year, right as we're starting the new year, he wrote this editorial. He said, this is a dark time and a dark year. It began horribly with a violent assault on the Capitol intended to stop the peaceful transfer of power, a first for our nation. The climate, and he's meaning climate change here, the climate showed us where we're headed as biblical droughts bake the West and suck reservoirs dry. 115-degree heat waves paralyzed Portland and Seattle, and a polar cold snap froze Texas solid. Forests in the western U.S. exploded into flames. Monstrous tornadoes, almost never seen in December, erased communities across Kentucky and the Midwest. The pandemic, we thought would beat in the spring, roared back twice through Greek-lettered, mutation-disguised variants that have filled hospitals and wards with voluntarily unvaccinated. In this season of renewal and hope, it takes real effort to find optimism about the future in our sour, beleaguered hearts. Okay, so this is a guy that's, a colorful writer, intending to create an impact on the reader. So I got one more paragraph for you. You can reasonably hope the pandemic will wane this year at last, after holding humanity hostage for more than 2 years. But there's no reason to expect an end to another viral epidemic of misinformation and tribal hatred that endangers our democracy. Americans no longer share common facts, information, or trusted sources and experts. Extremists on both sides are pushing the parties further apart, and on the right, a radical anti-democracy movement is gaining momentum. 3 retired U.S. generals warned this week that a disputed presidential election in 2024 could cause, quote, a total breakdown of the chain of command along party lines, end of quote, and actual civil war. If that sounds nuts, remember that 2 years ago, an insurrection and a pandemic were just as unimaginable. In the face of so many troubles and sorrows, what do we do? For perspective, I often think back to what my parents' generation faced and how dark it must have felt as 1941 gave way to 1942. Then, as now, surrender was not an option. Curse the darkness, fight, persist, the light is coming eventually. Okay, I know that has some, maybe even some triggering language, or has, kind of creates an effect depending on how you view these things. But the fact is, it's written and it's said in a major periodical, and it represents a perspective of how tricky this year is, and how tricky it is for me to come share economic information in an environment that's got so much, it's charged. So I also pulled another quote that I think gives a real contrast. So instead of this national contrast of all the situations challenging our country, I'm going to quote our speaker, Brad Wilson, who on the first day of the legislative session gave a speech, and he said this is the shorter. He said, it is said the pessimist complains about the wind, the optimist expects it to change, and the realist adjusts the sail. With deliberation, with cooperation, and with determination, we can create a future we all want. Let's be bold as we chart the Utah way forward. All right. there's the juxtaposition, right? You've got someone saying, whoa, this is a world of hurt, and what do? We just persist, and eventually the light comes. And then you have a speaker saying, hey, we adjust ourselves here in Utah. And we deliberate, we think, we cooperate, we have a determination about the future we want, and we chart a way forward. We lean into it. And those are the two kind of juxtapositions I want to share with you as we create this warm winter stew. Now, as I share, why did I pick a stew? Well, it's comforting, but it also has all these recipes and our ingredients, right? And there's so much going on, but I want to put a bunch of things in the pot and see what comes out as our sort of flavor profile. And I gotta tell you that when I asked our graphic designer to make me an image of the warm winter stew, this was the first thing I got. He didn't understand that I meant this, and he gave me this, and I thought, well, I'll conclude the presentation. But we're clearly talking about inviting you to the kitchen, breaking bread. And clearly, I'm gonna borrow from a lot of chefs. And this is kind of the reading list that I started looking into in December and the holidays and in early January. Some of them newer books, some of them older, but you see the Week magazine, you see The Economist, you see A Time to Build. This is a book about institutions, Peggy Noonan's Patriotic Grace, which is a call to a higher form of citizenship. The Soul of America by John Meacham really says some really positive things about what makes the foundation of our country. The Upswing by Robert Putnam, which looks way back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, talks about where we've been. Apollo's Arrow is a really nice piece on the pandemic. So all of this are kind of the chefs that I've turned to. And it turns out that our pot is made in Utah, and here's our recipe. I want to talk about history and what lies ahead. That's going in the pot. I want to talk about business intelligence. I want to think about some guiding principles, some of the strategies to succeed, and then I got a lot of seasonings that we're going to put in the pot. I'm going to begin with the seasonings and introduce the concepts of bounty and spread, make clear that we do face the challenges of a housing shortage and a great resignation, and then something that Robert Putnam calls the IGI. So we'll look at each of those individually. So these are just seasonings. The first one is bounty and spread. This comes from the book, The Second Machine Age. And the best way to summarize it, a lot of data covered in that book, but is to look at wages. I've got them on the vertical axes as inflation adjusted, experience adjusted, and then indexed to 1963. So you can see what's happened since 1963. Each of the colors is a different level of education attainment. So the red is college, graduate school, the blue is college graduate, the green some college, and you go from there. Super interesting graphic. Now it ends in 2008. I don't have an update on this. You can perhaps do that. It's pretty complicated to pull this data together. But if you look at 1963 to 73, you can see that all education levels had rising wages. And it was different, but all were on the right path and having increased prosperity. You can see in the 70s how they moved sideways. And then you can see in 1982, when Time magazine declared the personal computer as the person of the year, you can start to see the information age start to do its thing. And really what it does is starts to reward education and reward brain power and reward, you say computer scientists, engineers, professional occupations, service industries, and not so much some of the industries that are requiring of less education. So we have bounty in terms of all of the wealth that comes from the information age, and we have spread in that it's not affecting everybody the same. That's a seasoning in our pot. Another seasoning is our housing shortage. This is home prices in Utah. Percent change year over. You can see the gray is when things are appreciating, the red is when they're not. You can see what's happened to that last number, that 28.3. Good heavens. We are in a housing crisis. It's a strong word, but it's appropriate. Our team looks at the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and 2000s and said, did we build more homes or did we form more housing units? You can see because the black's higher than the red that we created more housing units than we had demand or household formation in each of these decades. If you go into the current past decade, and you can see that the household formation is higher in many of these years than the new housing units built. And what starts to accumulate along the bottom is a shortage or a gap, and it gets worse every year. We start to make some progress towards the end of the decade, but we absolutely face a housing shortage such that the median days on the market has now dropped to somewhere around 6. I think in the most recent data it's come up just a tad. But this is a seasoning in the pot, right? Because we've got the information age, picking winners and losers. We've got challenges like the housing shortage. And then we've got the great resignation going on. And you've heard that term, but it's this idea that as the pandemic hit, people dropped out of the labor force. And we've noted that all across the board, that's particularly acute in the 55 and older population. This is US data. It's showing you on 2 different axes here, the younger than 25 and the 25 to 54, that's the blue and the yellow. The red is on the right axis, and that's the 55 and older. And you see just this very shocking upward rise in the percent of the working age population that essentially is saying, I'm not interested in the job anymore. And this makes a lot of sense, right? These are people that own their homes. These are people that have had excess savings that they couldn't spend during the pandemic. These are people that have been rewarded with the stock market. And they have accumulated wealth and they don't need to work anymore. But they've dropped out of the labor force, creating a real tight labor market. And that's definitely affecting the Utah economy. All right, the last seasoning is what I'm calling IWI. And this is a term that Robert Putnam uses in the book, The Upswing. It's a little difficult to explain, but let me have you kind of think about this. This is going all the way back to the 1900s. And then taking us out to the present. And for 4 different dimensions, economics, politics, society, and culture, Putnam and his data people went and looked at the degree of cooperation that exists in all of these buckets. And so in the Gilded Age, so let's say 1900, you can see that there was not a lot of cooperation, a lot of individualism. And then it goes all the way towards the Eisenhower presidency, where it about peaked, post-World War II. And then you can see it's been dropping since. And what Putnam's basically saying is that I, we, I. And you can think of a lot of different ways to measure this, but I'm suggesting it to you as a really interesting indication of where our society is right now. There's a lot of benefits to an individualist I society, lots of personal freedoms, can be lots of innovation, lots of good things. But there's also things you don't do well together. And that creates social unrest and strife. That's the seasoning that we have in the pot. Okay, so I put the seasonings in. Are you following me? Are you making this stew together? The plot is thickening, or the flavor profile is thickening. We're going to start putting in some ingredients. The first one I want to put in is history. And I'm just doing some real recent history here. But, you know, COVID started, China's ever present, got social unrest, the different variants, January 6th, inflation above target, climate change and throughout this whole period. But what's particularly interesting to me in the pot is if you think about what's going to happen in the next few months, you've got Roe v. Wade decision. That will tear at some institutional fabric in our country. You've got the SCOTUS appointment, Supreme Court appointment. But, is that going to go smooth? I don't know. It hasn't the last couple of times. We got rate hikes. This is why I'm saying, Utah, this is a hard time to come present. We're in a tipping point. Like it's a changing time. Midterm elections, super interesting, right? And then you've got, some of these other things that I mentioned. Black swan over on the right, bottom right, the question mark. Black swan would be something that comes in that we're not expecting, and it would be very a shock. It could be a very virulent variant of COVID. If that's in our future, that changes everything, right? It could be the Fed making really bad policy missteps, and it creates a stock market, correction that we're not anticipating. So, as I think about those ingredients, I want to just be clear that our recent history, at least in Utah, has a lot of things that differentiate us from others. This shows you the fastest growing states in the country. Utah at 18.4% from 2010 to 2020, fastest growing state in the country. Nation grew by 7.4% over that same period. The darker colors are the fastest growing states, and you can see Utah right in the center of the fastest growing region. We're in Salt Lake County today. This is the share of growth in 2021 by county, and we're having a little fun here. We made Utah County red, and we made Salt Lake blue, having fun at the University of Utah. But 15.9% of the state's growth came from our largest county here in Salt Lake County. But the real story here is look at what's happening in Utah County. We are absolutely shifting economic power, political power, population power south. That's a phenomenon that's occurring. So that's part of our ingredients of the history here now. These are just different county population numbers and growth for 2021. So last year, what happened? But what I want to do is see, look over on the right. Look at Salt Lake and Utah County. Salt Lake grew by 0.8% in 1 year. Utah County grew by 2.9%. See that difference? And if you look over on the left, that's just the absolute change. We added just over 9,000 people to Salt Lake County through migration, births, whatever it was. Utah County added nearly 20. So you make that out over a few years, and things are interesting. Okay, also in terms of like the here and now history, this is the job growth trajectories of Utah and the US since January 2000. The red is Utah, the gray is the US. You see how we're typically growing at a higher rate than the US. You see the pandemic hits. The shaded gray bars, the vertical bars, those are recessions. The wider they are, the longer they last. So if you look over on the far right, you can just see how unique this time is. And you can also see how Utah wasn't hit as hard. See how the red line doesn't go as far down and pops out more quickly. This is, I think, among the most interesting data pieces I'm sharing with you today. It shows the job growth rate over a 2-year period for every state. So think of how many jobs there were in 2019, and then the pandemic happened, and all sorts of crazy things happened. When we take the pandemic out of it and just say, okay, from 2019 to 2021, what is the job growth? And if you look here, you can see Idaho, Utah, Arizona, Texas, only 4 states in this time frame that actually have a growing economy as measured by jobs. Stunning, right? Doing business in Utah feels very different from doing it in the rest of the country. Here's the employment change by industry in our state. Again, doing that 2-year time frame. As you can see, construction is the fastest growing industry in Utah. It's a white hot 12.4% growth. So we have a housing shortage, and it's still being fed by the fastest growing industry in our state that can't keep up because we have a rapidly growing state. And then you can see financial activity, manufacturing. For manufacturing to be growing by 5.8%, that tells me something about a resorting of manufacturing post-pandemic potentially, where people want to be closer to the supply chain. Okay, so that's just a little thinking of the ingredients for the history. Now I want to give you some more business intelligence, all to kind of help with your thinking. And I want you to ask questions as we go to the Q&A, so be thinking about that. But here's some of the business intelligence. All these things coming in. You run businesses, you've got to make decisions. And you've got high inflation, you've got rate hikes that are expected, you've got stock market volatility, and you can reasonably put these on a risk matrix, which we do at the Gardner Institute. On the left, you see the likelihood of something, and on the right, you see the economic severity of it. And I'm putting in red the 2 things that have me most concerned. Just, does the Fed land this plane correctly? And what happens with the pandemic moving forward? But you can see there's a lot of other things that are out there, geopolitical conflict. This is why it's a stew, right? A stew has a lot of ingredients that we're trying to make sense of. So we have amazing supply chain stress. Omicron made this even worse. You have manufacturing facilities that shut down. You have people that are sick that aren't working. You have things coming over from Asia that we're not getting, that take longer, creates a lot of stress in the supply chain, makes things more expensive, causes inflation. I put here the sting and recovery from high inflation. So this is the CPI percent change history. I've got shaded there forecast only to make you think about this is what the Fed is saying. They're saying that we've got control of this. We're going to raise interest rates. We have stimulated this economy as we needed to, and now as we get to full employment, we're going to stop putting so much money out there. And come the latter part of or the beginning of 2023, we'll have inflation back to its target, averaging about 2%. I don't believe that. That's sort of the plan. We also have unprecedented stimulus, and the best way to think of this that we've come up with at the Gardner Institute is the dot-com recession. The stimulus was 0.4% of GDP. The Great Recession was about 6.9% of GDP, to add those two numbers up, and the pandemic is approaching 25% of GDP. That's how much money is put out there, $1 in every $4. Now, it's not all at the same time, but just to give you a sense of that. So, in our pot, we have all of this going on, and I find myself thinking, what do you do? Like, you're a business leader, you're making decisions, you're taking risks, and you have all this going on. What should guide us? What should we be thinking about? And so, at the risk of, I'm just sharing my own thinking here, but I'm going to share some guiding principles. And Nicholas Christakis wrote Apollo's Arrow, but he said, pandemics call for great wisdom, both in our leaders and in ourselves. So he's basically saying, you know, pandemics make us rethink things, and we have to draw upon wisdom. Arthur Brooks, in his book, said, we need national healing every bit as much as economic growth. This is sort of interesting to me, because as I'm thinking about a guiding principle, I'm not just thinking about how do we keep us prosperous, I'm thinking about how do we heal our hearts in a country that is struggling. So my three principles are these. Practice warm-heartedness, respect facts and deploy reason, and seek balance. Now this sounds pretty philosophical. It's intended to be that way. You have to figure out the guiding principles for your own business. But I'm of the mindset that these are things we have to live by. These are things that guide us. So in practice warm-heartedness, Arthur Brooks talked to the Dalai Lama and said, Your Holiness, what do I do when I feel contempt? Because Brooks writes a lot about contempt in public life. And the Dalai Lama answered, practice warm-heartedness. So I'm thinking, in our interactions, as we work through 2022, 2023, let's practice warm-heartedness. So that's the first principle. The second principle is deploy facts and reason. And John Meacham in The Soul of America said, there is such a thing as discernible fact. There are facts we should and can agree on. I know there's a lot of competing information out there, but you know, the surface temperature of the earth is rising. It's a discernible fact. You might not agree with what to do about it. You might not agree with what caused it, but it is rising. And you start from what are the facts that are discernible that we can agree on and build from there. So deploy, seek facts and deploy reason. And then the last one, seek balance. President Randall, the president of the University of Utah, during the thick of the pandemic, reminded a group of people I was with. He said, when you focus on one problem, you lose perspective. And it's this idea of picking up a stone and putting it too close to the ground, you don't see what's around. And of course, this was very true in the pandemic, right? Everybody focused on public health and maybe didn't think enough about the economy. In our state, there was a lot of balancing of those two. Maybe it shows in the data in some way, but so my principles are warm-heartedness, facts and reason, and seek balance. All right, I'm going to look forward to your questions. The last thing I'm going to do is just give you some strategies to think about. Those are guiding principles, but in our pot, here's the strategies, my page 4. prepare for an economic resorting. This comes from Phil Dean, a senior fellow at the Gardner Institute. And in his presentation of the economic report to the governor, he said, the economy is changing. It's structurally changing. Be prepared for that resorting. Take care of yourself and your people. Care for those left behind. And invest in institutions. So on the economic resorting, we know there's structural changes afoot. Many places in our state have become Zoom towns. People get their employment check from out of state and they come live in Heber Valley, Park City, and Kanab, and St. George, and Salt Lake City. And that's a structural change. So that's an economic resorting. Technological advancement, of course, the pandemic accelerated all these things from remote sales to remote learning, telehealth, and all those things. And then the behavioral change, changes in preferences, people working from home. I think that's here to stay. Give you an example. This is data that Moody's Analytics pulls together, the large metro areas. This is net out migration from the urban core. And you just kind of see how, there wasn't as much and it was pretty stable, but pandemic hits and people left the urban cores. This is a flood to suburbia for livability reasons, and they can still, succeed in their profession. So this is economic resorting and whatnot. Here, I just pulled some data from the Gardner Institute records. Here's how youth mental health and suicide indicators. So it's 3 different years, 2013, 15, 17. You see high mental health needs, percent of youth goes up, moderate mental health needs goes up, felt sad or hopeless for 2 weeks or more in a row during the past year. Went up, and I'll let you kind of look at the other ones. This is where I'm saying take care of yourself and care for others, because the mental health challenges are very real. And then when I said, care for those left behind, this is the data that's showing the learning disruptions because of COVID by grade level in English language arts and in math based on the National Center for Improvement of Education Assessment. This is what percent has been lost of where we would expect them to be. This hurts a whole cohort of young people in our state. All right, the last one was invest in institutions, and now I'll open it up for your questions. What do I mean? What are society's institutions? This is the the Yuval Levin book about a time to build. So when I think of institutions, just think of all those things listed: family, schools, churches, the Supreme Court, the media is an institution, our universities are institutions. A lot of evidence of declining trust and faith in institutions. Look at that last bullet, Mrs. Levin. Without them, without institutions, we experience a form of social shapelessness, a crisis of connectedness, and a need for social replenishment. So this is the irony where our institutions have declined. Here's partisanship in presidential approval. And this is the own party approval minus other party approval. So it's just showing division. And you can see how tricky it's become. Here's the emptying pews and multiplying nuns. This is the fraction of the adult population with no religious attendance or no religious preference. So this would be a decline in institutions, churches. And you could look at this by a whole bunch of measures. I just pulled a couple. But what Mr. Levine says is he said, here are indications. When you have institutions in decline, rather than shaping character, molding things, institutions become platforms. So you think of an inability to agree on what's true. And if you look at the second bullet where it says formative to performative, instead of our institutions forming us, they're used to perform in political performance art. And there's a real danger to this. So this is where my strategy of investing in institutions comes to bear. Well, that is the warm winter stew. I know I went a lot of different places, principles, strategies, ingredients, seasonings, but these are the things that we're tracking and watching at the Gardner Institute. And I like to say, bon appetit, it's all yours. So with that, Roger.
Thank you very much. Just give her a hand. Natalie's got some time for questions, so she can Any question you have for her, she'll answer. She's had some doozies the last few days from us, so if you have a question, please let me know. I'll bring the microphone to you and you can ask the question.
I hope I planted some seeds, but honestly, the whole point of this was to get you thinking and really thinking about what lies ahead, particularly in the next 6 months to 2 years.
Thanks, Natalie. So one thing I haven't heard much talked about is, I know the boomer generation is one of the biggest populations out there. I think like the Gen Zs or whatever, millennials, I don't think have the same population to replace the boomer population. Do you have any thoughts on, as boomers start to retire and such, they start to liquidate assets, whether it's liquidating stocks or downsizing homes, and if the impact that would have with that big population just liquidating assets as they move into retirement?
Yeah, great question. Listen, this is another place where I want to draw a distinction. So in the United States, the boomer population is larger than the millennial population. In Utah, the millennial population is larger than the boomer. Isn't that interesting, right? Our high birth rate has given us that. So this is a place where this is absolutely a national trend that was very evident before the pandemic. And it just continues and maybe has been accelerated because we've lost a lot of people that we would have otherwise lost. And so this is economic resorting. And in this case, it's demographic resorting that absolutely requires a change in strategy and thinking, and it creates risk. And, you know, there's a saying that we use that demographics is destiny. So if you want to know your future, understand your demographic makeup, and your question is spot on, that there's absolutely going to be rippling effects from this massive generation that's basically aging out of decision roles, aging out of their income years, and unliving assets.
Hey, thank you. Another question.
And my dad, as he walks over there, but isn't it interesting that in Utah, we feel a little different?
One question I had, is there a market where there's the opposite of a housing surplus? In my mind, thinking because of you have the urban exit and remote work available. At what point is there an inflection where you say, look, I can't afford to live here because of the housing shortage. I'm going to go live where there's a housing surplus. Is there markets that have that scenario?
So this is really interesting. So I would say that there's places in rural Utah where there's a housing surplus. But for the most part, as we look at population centers within our state, they're all very stressed right now. This is true in Southwest Utah. This is true in Northern Utah. It's true in urban Utah. You can go to a place like the Uinta Basin, and when oil prices are high, they're full, and when oil prices are low, they have surplus. Part of your question might be other states, and there's certainly other states that have some different housing dynamics, but I will tell you that I follow the housing starts and look at them nationally, and we have a nation that has supply constraints for housing and has labor constraints for housing. And we're still a nation that's growing. And so for the most part, it is a owner's or a seller's market. Okay.
Thanks, Natalie. Curious on your thoughts on the inland port, kind of what's happening there. Inland port and the airport, and then moving up the prison, going around all those big factors in what they do in the next 35 years.
Well, on Capitol Hill, the big things that they're very mindful of, they call them generational investments, are the point of the mountain and the prison, the inland port, and the 2030 Olympic Winter Games. Those are big, generational things that are afoot. If I just take them individually, the point of the mountain is on its way, right? If the prison is being moved, the new one's not done, but it's very much under construction. Plans for the point of the mountain are rolling out, and it will be the key there is they don't just want to open up this land and have a field with housing, as much as that might be interesting and help with some needs. It's state-owned land in the center of the most rapidly growing part of the Utah economy, Silicon Slopes. And our state has made a decision to develop it with a public purpose. So there's a point of the Mountain Land Development Authority that's looking at this. So that is on target, and more good to come, but it will be a job creation center as well as having some housing and open space. I do the inland port. Again, our state's made a decision to pursue the inland port, set aside money for it. Has an inland port director that we recruited from, I think, the Port of LA. And so it will happen, and it brings together I-15, I-80, I-84, I-70, that great new Salt Lake City International Airport, the UP rail lines, and makes Salt Lake City a place where we're tightly tied into the global supply chain. And it will have its deterrents, but it is definitely a generational investment we're making. Now, I've already said my piece on the Olympics, but does that help? These are big, big things, and I liken them to somebody way back when decided to do Hill Air Force Base. Somebody way back when decided to, do the Olympics in 2002. Somebody did the Intermountain Power Project. These are big things that affect our state for decades, and we've got 3 big ones going right now.
Next question.
This is, by the way, why I wanted to share the Speaker Wilson quote with you, because I'm trying to draw a juxtaposition between some of the crazy contextual things happening in our world and the really solid things happening, fundamentals in our state.
You mentioned in your presentation that the potential disruption starts coming up. Is the Fed making missteps? What are some things that you're keeping an eye on, or leading indicators or anything else that the Fed is going the wrong direction?
So I'm going to start with just the mainstream opinion here is that we'll get 4 rate hikes in 2022, 25 basis points each, 1 quarter. That's a starting point. If we go into March and they raise rates 50 basis points, that would surprise me, right? And I'd be starting, what do I know? If we went into March and they didn't act, again, I'd be, what don't I know? Because what I know is that rates must rise. This economy has a lot of liquidity in it, and we have inflation worries. And they brought rates down during a once in 100-year event. Maybe we're going to get more now, but they did what they needed to do to keep the United States of America performing as well as it could during the pandemic. And they've got to get them up. And so what am I watching for? I'm watching labor force participation rates. I'm watching consumer confidence. I'm watching unemployment, job growth. But what I don't want to be is surprised. And I don't think markets want to be surprised either. So that's kind of what I'm keeping an eye on. And we had Mary Daly was in town. Well, actually it was virtual. We had her for an hour, and I was able to interview her. And this is a Fed that's very proactive, won't rest on the sidelines, and I think they'll act.
With regard to the inflation that you mentioned earlier, how much of kind of the future measurements of that is going to slow just based on the base effects of what we've experienced over the last little bit, do you think? And how persistent do you expect it to be?
Love your question. So anyone who studies economics right now is really kind of in the spotlight, right? Because all of a sudden everybody's talking about inflation. That's never really happened, at least for a long time. Channel 5 is like doing those specials on, inflation, how it affects your pocketbook. And, I want people to understand that this is something that economists and policymakers know what it is and know how to work with it. So I'll give you an example. Some people, they ask the question, is it transitory or is it long-term? And I'm like, well, the Fed can absolutely stop it. They just cause a recession when they do. Nobody wants that. Recessions are hard. We just had one. And so so the question is, what do you do to manage it in this environment? And I'm gonna be a little vulnerable here, but I think people are a little too skittish and afraid. I think they're too afraid. So let me give you an example. I believe the inflation for calendar year 2021 was 4.3%. People see bigger numbers and it scares them, but they don't realize that you're always dealing with different dates, a starting date and end date for that growth rate. So they might see December of last year to December of this year, and it's like 5-6%, they're pulling their hair out. But the average for the year is 4.3. If I look at the state forecast, what's going into the budget for what they're deciding on, in October, their forecast for 2022 was 3%. Hence, the governor's budget had a 3.5% cost of living increase. He took the 4.3 and the 3 and kind of picked an average and did that for state workers. Anyway, my point is that, oh, and then one last thing, I think it's worth saying, what's causing it? What's the root cause? So we know that there's a supply chain problems that are pushing costs up. So there's a supply side phenomenon. And then we also know there's all this money out there, too much money chasing too few goods. So there's a supply side and a demand side, both occurring simultaneously. So on the supply chain, that'll get worked out. They will figure that out. There's money to be made. They will figure that out. It just will take time. On the demand side, what is it? It's excess savings, which gets spent. It's stimulus, which gets spent. And it's pent-up demand, things we couldn't do during the travel and things that we now want to do. Anyway, all of that will happen. And so the amazing thing is markets figure it out, markets correct. And to me, it's just a matter of how well do we manage it going forward. And I have some optimism that with the what we know about inflation, what our leaders, mean with the monetary policy makers in this country, that will, I don't think we'll be through with inflation by the end of the year, but I think we'll be a lot better than we are today. I hope that helps. Just showing some of the things are temporary and we've got the tools to deal with it and we're on our way. Perhaps the worst is behind us.
Any other questions? We have time for one or two more questions. Okay, right here.
Okay, so this is kind of a controversial subject. But unemployment is a natural part of the economy. We have a natural rate. But there has been a lot of discussion at every level of full employment, fixing the economy. What is kind of your rate of natural unemployment that we're looking at to maintain a healthy economy?
I want to ask you where you studied economics. Are you a University of Utah person? Are you a Weaver? Or are you what are you?
I actually studied in Texas at the
Okay,
University of Houston.
Well, terrific. It is a controversial topic to economists, but this is what you think of. You want to have, the rule of thumb for me is 3.5% unemployment rate and the labor force participation around 63-64%. Now that's nationally, but that's what you're looking at. The other thing you're looking at for full employment is rising wages. You expect wages to rise when you're in full employment. We have all of those things challenging Utah economy right now. Our unemployment sits at 1.6. I'm looking at Josh. What do you think? 1.9. You know, that's incredibly low. And so I would make the call that we're full employment in the Utah economy and the nation's getting close. All right, Roger, where are we at? We have one more.
One last question. Anybody have one last question?
Easy one.
Okay, I have, oh, right here. Colby, you're the winner. It better be really good.
It was a long walk.
You had a slide early on, I think you called it balance spread, talking about education and relative value of education, but cut off in 2008. I'm just curious if you can project that forward. Do you think that there's any contraction in those layers, or what is the relative value of education going forward? And then how do we, as a state, make sure that those most vulnerable among us are getting the opportunities to have education?
So that graphic that showed that dispersion, that spread by education level after the personal computer came out, that comes from the second machine age. So I just took the data right from them. It's actually quite hard to calculate, or I would have had our team do it. They're adjusting for experience, so they're making all sorts of statistical adjustments. So it's not just look it up and, compute growth rates or create an index. One other thing about the data that I think you find interesting is that so it's hard to do. I can't remember. All right, well, so to go back to your point, I know what it was. So I thought about having our team just extrapolate it. It's super easy to do an extrapolation. But I didn't know if it'd be fair, because I just don't have enough information. So to answer your question, I actually was going to say forecasted or extrapolated, and I opted not to do that because I wanted to give them that message. But what do I think? I work with, I work in higher education. It's the most incredible mission that you can have, right? To take people's lives and give them the skills to be successful and prosperous. And I think we absolutely have a world that rewards education. I think education has to completely change, has to change with the world. What can we do to help the people among us who are socioeconomically disadvantaged? Give them the skills to succeed. And this is a little different, but they have up on Capitol Hill, and I think it'll pass this year, an earned income tax credit. It's a tax credit that rewards people who work on the lower end of the pay scale. It's proven to increase labor force participation rates. It targets exactly who you want to help. We would join, I think we would be like the 30th state to do this at state level. There's a federal EITC. It's one of these areas that both conservatives and liberals agree on, and our state's gonna do it. I'm really confident in. So we're getting a big income tax cut. Guess who that benefits? High income. But the earned income tax credit benefits low income, and then they're also gonna make a change on Social Security taxable income to help fixed income. And in that way that they'll get a fair spread of our tax cuts, 200 million coming our way. Hope that helps. Roger, thanks. Bon appetit, everyone.
Thank you. Natalie, thanks for coming, speaking to us. We truly want to thank everyone who came today to read this forecast and take it out with you. Let's make a difference.